I'm not going to talk about what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it. How many of you here, just so I get a sense of the audience, how many of you here have either taken a cataloging class in which you use the Anglo-American cataloging rules, or have actually cataloged using it? Wow, that's impressive. So it's like I can just sit down and not, have to say anything at this point. So as you know, it's all over. As you know, AACR, Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, about 600 pages is the rules for how to do descriptive cataloging with the examples, lots of examples in it. It's kind of Socratic, there's a rule and then there's kind of the answers of how to do it. And it looks, a simple rule and response looks like this. Here's one for if you've got more than one map on a sheet, then you create this string that says 6 maps on one sheet. And one of the things I think is really key about AACR, AACR2, is the fact that it's really about creating text strings. Highly formalized text strings, but text strings. I mean, in a sense, it's in that grouping, if you would do it, along with things like sonnets, limericks, and haikus. These are highly formalized bits of text. And when you're all done, you have something that looks like this. This, to me, is sort of the sine qua non. It's the AACR2 cataloging for AACR2. Plus, it has Michael Gorman on it. I mean, how much better can it get, right? It's like everything that's wrong with cataloging. Okay. I was going to stop myself from saying that. If you code this all up in MARC format and put it out on a screen, it's still text strings. I look at MARC as being really a text markup language. Yes, there's a little bit of data in it, but primarily what it is a text markup language. Now, AACR2 came out in 1978, I believe. I think I'm close. By 2004, AACR had ++ again, and people were beginning to work on AACR3. And one of the reasons for working on AACR3 is that the Anglo-American cataloging rules is about describing objects, physical objects. And one thing that really threw a wrench into that was when we started having virtual data. Our information was in virtual objects, and AACR just didn't really cover that well. Because it's all about looking for the title page, copying what's on that, seeing what the title is, counting the number of pages, weighing it, measuring it, all of that. It is very object in the physical object oriented. So the Joint Steering Committee for the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules began working on AACR++, and shortly into it they decided that what they were doing was so radically different that they could no longer call it AACR. And they changed the name to RDA, Resource Description and Access. And the Joint Steering Committee, after a couple of years, changed its name from the Joint Steering Committee for the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules to Joint Steering Committee for RDA. It's interesting, they took the AA out of it. As you look at the participants, it's still very Anglo. But this is what we're working on now. Now, RDA had, I think, came up with some very interesting goals, which they state in some of their early documentation. I'm going to move this closer to me without losing the connection. There we go. One of the first goals of RDA was they were going to use Ferber as their basic data model and conceptual model. This was going to, Ferber basically, in the minds of these people, describes our domain. They also had a goal to simplify things, that, the 600 pages of AACR2 are really hard to deal with. One of the problems is that there's every possible exception and whatever in there. AACR2 is really, has sections in it for things like how do you record the names of Thai royalty, and what do you do with a book that is written by a spirit speaking through a medium, who is the author? right? And I don't know if you know this, but between AACR1 and AACR2, the answer changed. Very significant. So the idea was that RDA is to simplify this whole process. RDA was also being designed so that, in theory, it could be used by other communities, although I haven't seen a really good definition of what is meant by other communities. What I'm assuming this is the communities closest to libraries, which tend to be museums and archives. And one of the reasons why we need to share data is because many museums have libraries, many libraries also have an archive department, and the data that they're creating in those different departments is not interoperable. So we need to fix that problem. One of the other goals of RDA was it was not going to determine display, that you were going to get to display things however you want. AACR2 is very much a presentation format. It tells you how it's supposed to be shown to the user. And this was supposed to go away. And of course, what this brings up, and if you've been on any of these interesting lists, what you know is that the whole question of ISBD, which is just a red flare in the cataloging world. International Standard Bibliographic Description has been created at an international level so that the bibliographic data being created by national libraries throughout the world would have some things in common. And that is why we have all of that weird punctuation in the MARC records, the slashes and the brackets and all that. That is all determined by ISBD. Well, RDA is not requiring that you use all that weird punctuation in your record because a program can add it in there for you. And this creates great international discord. And RDA also wants to recognize that data being created today goes through a computer. And I didn't just have a picture of any old computer. So this is my information seeking workspace. Well, it's actually one of them. I have a standing one too. This is the sitting one. So here is a shot of RDA, just, open to 2 pages, just so you can, it isn't clear, I realize, but this is what it looks like. RDA is 10 sections, 37 chapters, plus 13 appendices. We've seen about half of it. The full draft is supposed to be out in June, just in time for ALA. And there'll be 3 months in which people can comment on it. And then the final is out in 2009, and there's people already planning implementation. So we've seen half of it. There's people already planning implementation, okay? The about half that we've seen, because we don't know that we've seen half because we've only seen some, right? So we don't know what the whole is yet. But I counted up what I have, and now, not counting the appendices, is over 800 pages. And it's 800 pages of instructions with examples of what you're supposed to do. Now, in this case, the instruction has changed from what we saw in the AACR2 example, but guess what? 6 maps on 1 sheet. So the catalogers are all arguing about how different this is and how hard it's going to be, and I'm looking at it and I'm going, I don't see any change. A couple of interesting things to know about RDA are RDA is not to be a printed document. It looks like they're going to have to print a copy, but it is not intended as a printed document. RDA is intended as an online service. And the drafts that we've seen are designed to be put into an online service. They are huge Word files. And each document is one big Word table. And there's this nice woman named Nanette. I don't remember her last name right now, but if you run into her at a meeting, buy her a drink. She needs it. She is writing code to turn this into an online service using things like, how bold is this heading? I think she's a genius because she thinks she's going to get it done. Now, one of the things that you can't tell when you look at this example here is that this, where it says 6 maps on one sheet, it's quite possible that the word maps and the word sheet are controlled vocabularies. There are many controlled vocabularies inside RDA. There is a controlled vocabulary, for example, for the physical carrier, and this goes on for page after page after page. As you know, there's many controlled vocabularies inside MARC as well, and it's a bit of a problem because if you want to add one more value to one of these controlled vocabularies, you have to go to the MARC Standards Committee and have it added to the standard. They are not outside. Now, I know that Library of Congress is working right now to pull these out, put them in SCOS, and have them available outside of the standard. We still have to change our practices, but this is a long-standing practice in the library world that we just has to go. Well, not being one to kind of just sit back and not speak my mind, after looking at RDA and being so frustrated with it, many other people were also frustrated, and I engaged my partner in crime, Diane Hillman, and we wrote an article for DLive magazine criticizing RDA. I think we were a little too subtle. We named it Resource Description and Access Cataloging for the 20th Century. And many readers didn't quite pick up on that the first time they saw the title. And we basically explained that, you know, the time for doing cataloging in this way is long past. You know, we simply cannot do it this way anymore. We also talked on a number of lists, and I had done a diagram here, and I'm so bad, my visuals. I mean, I'm going to hire Rob Stiles to, if I ever get rich, he's going to do all of my presentations for me because I do the worst looking diagrams. So I stole this out of the Dublin Core Singapore framework. It's not what I was going to say, but it's close enough that I can illustrate what I'm talking about with it without you having to look at the really embarrassingly bad diagram. So basically what we tried to explain to people is that you need, in these days of doing data processing, you have to have some underlying solid framework behind the data that you're working on. You can't just decide you're going to call something a title and zip off and create this. In the Dublin Core Singapore framework, they're saying that their basic underlying technology is RDF. I would be happy with anything else there as long as it works. You know, if we were talking here about the internet, we'd have TCP/IP down there. So anything underlying that works is fine. Then you have to determine what your domain standards are, and this is where you do things like you determine what are your vocabularies in your domain, what kind of syntax are you going to use. And then you move up and you do what we call application profiles. And one of the things, application profiles are really important for us because one of the problems, one of the reasons why AACR2 is 600 pages and RDA will be, you know, 1,500 pages if they were to print it, is because they're trying to satisfy every possible need and every possible situation in one set of rules. It doesn't work. What you need is for different people in close-by communities to be able to take the same underlying framework, the same vocabularies, create their own application profiles, add on if they need to, not add on if they don't need to, and yet be interoperable. And that's the only way it's going to work. What do we have today? We have this thing that is the very top node, which is what we have is usage guidelines. We have usage guidelines without having data elements, without having an underlying model, unless you consider Ferber that underlying model. I mean, we have just don't have even what we need to begin to create really good, rigorous metadata. Well, somewhere around April, May of 2007, a miracle occurred because someone at the British Library managed to get together people from the Joint Steering Community, Joint Steering Committee, people from Dublin Core, and some people from Dublin Core who have worked a lot on the semantic web work with W3C. And they got them together in a room at the British Library for 2 days, and the people working on RDA agreed that they do need to do rigorous description of their data elements, and that they would work together with Dublin Core to create these. And if you go to the the task force wiki, what you'll find is a description of, much more detailed description of the project. Basically, we're going to declare, if we can discover them, declare all of the data elements in RDA in RDF. We'll declare the value of vocabularies in SCOS. We'll register all the vocabularies in an open registry. They will all get URIs. And then we're going to work on the methods for creating application profiles. And the Dublin Core people are dying to do the first application profile, which would be Dublin Core and RDA. Now, whether or not all this is going to work, I don't know, but it's a really interesting idea to be working on. Later on today, John Phillips is going to talk about the NSDL registry. This is what we have to work with. I'm not saying it's exactly what we're going to use to produce whatever the final form is of this, but right now we have the NSDL registry for registering vocabularies. An interesting thing happened. It was about this time last year, and I'd been reading RDA and getting very frustrated with it. And I'd looked at that list of carriers that I showed you, the physical carriers, and decided that it was really dangerous to have something like that printed in, a big document, even if you're going to put the big document online. And I went to the office supply store, and I saw for the first time that people were selling tax software on thumb drives. And a year before, thumb drives had been these precious things. Now they were just sort of being thrown away with software on them, right? And of course, I went back and looked in RDA, and they didn't have a carrier for that. So I, posted this and talked about it, and Diane went on to the registry, Diane Hillman, who works on this, and showed what you could do if you had your vocabularies registered. And so she created a registry for RDA carrier and put them all in with not a lot of detail behind it, and then showed what you could do if you had a new item. And when we first put this in, it said provisional, that you could add a new item. It could be provisional. Everybody could get access to it. I just have a conniption fit every time the LC posts to the MARC list that there is a new term being added to one of the vocabularies, and they post it as an email note. And all I can see is all over the country, all these people are, running to their ILS, or the poor vendors are giving, the lowest employee the thing to pull up the big table and add this in. It is just, I am speechless every time they do it. And so this was trying to show you that you don't have to do it that way. You can have alternate forms of the term. You can have definitions. All of this could be pulled down into any system that wanted to use it. And if you aren't a human coming in, but a machine, of course, you could get a machine-usable format. This one happens to be SCOS RDF, but John will talk about any other formats that they can envision putting out in the future. So at this point, we felt very successful. Turned out that the RDA people had thought about what their data elements are. They were in an Excel spreadsheet. An Excel spreadsheet, of course, that was a document. I don't know what I dislike most, the fact that people create documents in Excel spreadsheets, or that Excel actually encourages you to do that. But the way that you know that something is a sub element is that it isn't bold and it's spaced over 2 spaces. But there is a spreadsheet that we can use to look at what they think the data elements are and get started. And we've started this process of looking at the data elements. And I honestly don't know if we'll be able to do something in 2 months or 20 years. I mean, the issues are huge. So just to give you an idea of some of the issues that we run into, an enormous number of the things that we have in our records serve multiple functions. Multiple implicit functions, not explicit functions. Almost every data element that you can look at in a MARC record serves more than one function. And that makes it very hard to define them. And we don't know whether we're going to have to define, 3 different sort of types of title, or if we can, to what extent we can allow things to just continue to have these mushy, ambiguous multiple functions. You look at this, and if you've studied Ferber, you go, oh, great. Okay, so we've got Random House. That's the publisher. We can have a publisher node over here. It can have Random House's address and everything. We can link that in to the record, and so that then you can go out to Random House and find everything that Random House published. This is not the publisher. In RDA and ACR and all of library cataloging, this is the name that appears on the title page that purports to be the publisher. You put it in here even if you know it's wrong. If you know it's wrong, you may make a note saying, no, that was really Harper and Row that published that. So this isn't the publisher as an entity. This is the name that appears on the title page. And this is a kind of different point of view that we're struggling very hard with as to how we turn this into something that is usable. I hate what we do with author names. No one in the world should ever have to look at that. And that is as bad as forcing someone to look at a raw URI. I just think it's terrible. But of course, it's not a person. It's a preferred form of a name of someone or something that has a creator role. If you have a person, Mark Twain, who writes under different names, then that's multiple of these preferred forms. If you have 2 people who write under one name, you have one preferred form. In other words, we're talking about a name, not a person. And sometimes the name is the same as a person, and sometimes it isn't. So people who want to, pop FOF into bibliographic data, you may be able to do that on the scientific side. You definitely can't do that for an awful lot of what we have in our library catalogs. There are a lot of elements in RDA that talk about the elements. In other words, there's a lot of metadata, and we're going to try to push that up to the application level. There are a lot of things called statements. Publisher statement doesn't exist. It is merely a grouping of place, publisher, and date. And when they diagram it, publisher is a blank node. Edition statement can have all kinds of stuff in it. Maybe that should be broken apart, but it isn't broken apart. Edition statements is big string with all kinds of things in it, although it's highly controlled what you do put in there. This is the one that really gets me, and that if people on RDA-L ever discover that I've said this, I'll never hear the end of it, but I just hate this thing that comes after the slash in the title. I just hate it. It is called the statement of responsibility. It's kind of part of the title, but it's not part of the title. At this point, the title is playing at least 2 roles. It's being the title, but it's also being a surrogate for the title page. And then you've got this separate thing that comes after the slash that simply cannot stand alone. How do you make a data element out of something that simply cannot stand alone? The catalogers love it. They think it's the most important thing in the record. We've had arguments up and down and forever about it on the various lists. But for me, trying to process data, it is a big problem. You may think of, nice Ferber model that you've got a series and you have books that are in the series. No, the series is actually inside the description of the book. So just the way we have it today, the way that RDA views it, it isn't like, you've got a book here, and you've got these series up here, and you've got this sort of hierarchical model. In fact, the series is sort of subordinate to the description of the book, which is something that is, I think, rather difficult. And even though we talk about works and expressions, the fact is that the work-expression relationship may simply be in a note. So this one is a translation of the work. There's nothing to say that stuff is structured the way we think of it. So if you think about Ferber and you're envisioning this Ferber world, you're going to need Rob's software to pull it back out of the records, at least if the RDA people keep going in the direction they are. Now, one of the big issues is is Ferber itself. So RDA wants to be aligned with Ferber. They associate certain data elements, Ferber elements. So, for example, in this one, Ferber has persons and corporate bodies, but RDA had to add families, which apparently they feel they really need. Okay, so Ferber doesn't have families. So to what extent is Ferber our model? Do we go back and change Ferber? Or do we go forward? I mean, is Ferber based on RDA? Is RDA based on Ferber? I mean, I find a real confusion here. RDA doesn't cover subjects. That description and access, the access part, is access to the description. In other words, it's access to names and titles and that kind of thing, but there's no subject access being done at all, so we don't know how that fits in. But the really big problem is Group 1, and I've been caught here a couple of times already saying that I'm just not sure about the Group 1 entities. Neither are the RDA people. Group 1 is the work, expression, manifestation item. As a matter of fact, they punted on it, and they combined works and expressions and manifestations and items. At some points, they're pulled apart. They have separate elements. At some points, they share elements. No one seems to be able to work with these and to do anything with them. So I guess I don't feel so bad that I don't really quite get it. So now I come to what I call the fuck list. Frequently unanswered questions, because there's more unanswered questions than answered questions in this project. We're just getting started, and you know, every time I look at anything, I have more questions than I have answers. So one of the questions is Ferber the right model? And we don't know. The IFLA people are working at this point to put the Ferber entities into a registry. If you've gone far enough, if you've gone beyond just the diagrams in the Ferber document, which is actually hard to do, I mean, most of us just get stuck at the diagrams, but if you go beyond those, you'll find that each element has a list of attributes, this long list of attributes. If you look for those same attributes under that same element in RDA, there's a little bit of overlap, but not much. So we've got a real issue with calling Ferber our domain model. Is RDF the right format? People ask me this, and I don't know. It's what we have today. It's what the people working on the project know. It's undoubtedly what we'll use over the next 6 to 12 months. We surely aren't seeing it as being the only possible one, but you know, you work with what you got. If somebody's got something better, you know, love to hear about it. Is this going to replace Mark 21? Well, actually, this has nothing to do with Mark 21, except that I think it could be used to create a much better bibliographic record, a much more flexible bibliographic record, a bibliographic record that can explicitly deal with relationships, that can interact on the web, that can be part of web services and part of the semantic web. At this point, I have to tell you, I mean, I have sat on the MARC Standards Committee for close to 20 years. I don't care what happens to MARC. I'm over it. I'm going forward, okay? It's just time to go. So I say let's build this new record and just do it. This is a big one. Who's going to be in charge? How, you know, who are we to get up there and, you know, define, you know, the library world's data elements? This is huge. As a matter of fact, we were very worried about it. We still are very worried about it. We put forth a large grant proposal to NSF to create these vocabularies, but mainly to create how they're going to be maintained, how they're going to manage a community around them so that it works. And NSF replied, this is going to change everything in the library world. Everything. But the technology is not interesting. And they turned us down. Well, my reply is most technology isn't interesting. What's interesting is what people do with it. The technology itself could be, nah, you know, it's what you do with it. But that isn't what they're interested in funding. So we're here, you know, doing this little thing with very little funding. All of us just kind of, you know, hoping that somebody will come along and just, you know, rain some money down on us for all the work we've already done. But this is, I think, one of the biggest issues in our community today is how do we make decisions about really important fundamental things in our community, like our data standards, our bibliographic standards. And we don't have a good way to do that. I often ask myself this one and don't really have an answer. What were we thinking when we took this on? It's fascinating. It's going to turn out to be harder than we ever thought. My big fear is it's going to turn out that it'll only work if people in the cataloging community make some changes, and you know how hard that might be. But we're going to go forward because it's fascinating. It's intellectually stimulating. We're really into it. But what were we thinking? And then this is you asking me, how can I help? This is my favorite question. So what we have right now is we have, we're using the Dublin Core model for getting projects done. We're using the Dublin Core Wiki, which is one of the worst wikis I've ever worked with. It's an aging version of Moin Moin. It doesn't allow comments, and it throws me out Python errors every time I try to save a page. Okay, but this is where it's happening. We're putting out everything that we produce. We're pointers to documents, that kind of thing. We want to bring people along with the thinking on this. And one of the things that's been so exciting for me this meeting is I found some people who think like this, and I don't feel quite so alone in the world. But there's some ideas here that really need to start circulating. And then again, following the Dublin Core model, discussion will take place on an email list that we have not been able to get going, hoping that we can get people talking about this. The email list is on Jiskmail in the UK. If you don't want to, and I understand that I don't want to sign up for yet another email list, this one, fortunately, the messages go almost in real time to the list. So you can follow it by just, going over here. I don't know if it has RSS feeds on it, but anyway, you can hop over here and check it periodically until you get to a point where you think, there's something that you really have to jump in. I think a lot of the early discussion is going to be sort of philosophy about cataloging, and the technology may come in a bit later. And if we get to the technology point and I don't see some of you people on the list, I'll start, pinging you and letting you know that we're getting to that point. So that's what I have, and I've purposely left a little extra time, actually a good amount of time for discussion, because I didn't really come here to talk to you about this. I really want to hear from you and to talk with you about this, because I think that what we're looking at is something that could really change the data that we're working with, but I believe in a positive way. So I'm going to stop here and just see what kind of questions and discussion we have. I mean, I'm sure I didn't ask all of the unanswered questions.
I'll ask a stupid question since we have a question. Where do you think this is in the process of actually moving forward to where you need people like the people in this room to start working on things, or to jump in to make sure that the data structures make sense from a system standpoint of view?
Right. We haven't started, except for that one example that we haven't started inputting things into the registry. So go to John's, be sure to be here for John's talk this afternoon, because he's going to talk about the technology of the registry. And we can easily start getting in the value vocabularies like that carrier, and people could start playing with those. It's going to take a while to get other elements in, but what we're going to really see it as being an incremental process. So I'm hoping that within another couple of months that we have at least a few things in there, as well as a number of the value vocabularies, so people can start playing with the technology just as technology as opposed to content. In the back.
More and more data, the quality of the metadata is dropping, and these relationships are all about somebody having to create these relationships, so you can have all these great containers and methods to express all this. They can express relationships, but if you don't have people or systems that can tie everything together, they can articulate.
Right. Yes. So this is a question that comes up a lot, like, isn't this going to be even more complicated, and isn't it even going to be harder for people to create these records? I actually think the opposite once we get going. I am just appalled at how poor our cataloging systems are and how little they help people make decisions. And I've talked to people who've done some interesting experimentation. The folks at NLM and NAL have done some work of having sort of expert systems go through documents before they do this at the indexing level, before the indexers get them, and just go ahead and fill in a great deal of the data elements and also make suggestions. What I see with this ability to make connections is that we should be able to serve more data to the cataloger rather than leaving them alone with a book and a copy of RDA trying to figure things out. Our data doesn't interact well, and we don't use it in an interactive way during the cataloging process. So I would like to see us moving in that direction.
Point for books and traditional library materials, but we're also getting more of the information that our patient scheme is getting more distributed. It comes from more sources. The records themselves, the data sources are all over the place too. I was wondering if you could comment on establishing relationships from data sources all over creation.
You know, actually, a bunch of us have been having discussions about this. Is how do you do this linking? I don't think that we know exactly how we're going to do it, but one of the things that to me is really clear is that once, and I think this is really part of the semantic web, is that once that you start linking things, linking becomes easier. I do think we're going to spend a lot of time creating what I think of as kind of translators, where you toss something out there and it comes back with, you know, this might be this, or this. This might hook up well with this, and this. I see it as XISBN writ really, really large. That the semantic web itself is going to have to help people make the connections. I mean, it's not going to be people just going out. There's going to have to be a certain amount of bringing in knowledge and presenting people with choices and sometimes even making decisions.
One of the big differences I see between RDA and AACR1 and AACR2 is that back then the librarians were more in control of the process. So, you know, they could come up with the rules. All we had to do was print out cards and put them in a box, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas now we're wholly dependent on vendors to support the things that we're doing, which seems like are there vendors? I guess my question is: are vendors on board? Are you working with vendors, and are vendors on board with this? Because otherwise, I see, you know, there's a disconnect into how we can. Where do we go with this if there's no vendor support?
We took this at which ALA was it? It must have been last summer. Where were we in summer? Philadelphia? Does anybody remember? Whatever the summer one was. We took this to, no, actually it was January. It was the one before that. We went to the AVIAC meeting. AVIAC is a NISO-sponsored committee, automation vendor something, where all the library vendors can get together. And Diane, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but Diane got up and explained this and explained that we were going to start working on these vocabularies, et cetera, and their reply was, well, that has nothing to do with us. So we'd love to bring the vendors on board. They, so far, don't get it. And that is really scary. That is really scary. You want to use the microphone?
One of the nice things about Mark, to the extent that I'm willing to say anything nice about it, is that it at least gives vendors something relatively concrete to code against. Maybe badly, but they can at least do something, and most systems can at least load and interchange Mark records. RDA is a description standard. We haven't yet figured out whether RDF will be the serialization or whatever. So how can we get to the point where we can give vendors a set of concrete specifications to work with, or do we need to wait for programmers at libraries and the open source community to hash these things out and build something that way.
Mm-hmm. I can't imagine that we would ever end up in a situation where all the libraries aren't pretty much sharing something very close to the same standard for the data record, because we do so much interchange of information. The folks working on RDA are looking at MARC. Their first foray into this was they looked at MARC and at Dublin Core, and they came to the MARC standards meeting saying, yes, we could fill in a MARC record with RDA. And yes, we could fill in a Dublin Core record with RDA. And my response is, I could fill in a MARC record with my shopping list. You can fill it in with anything. The question is can you express RDA in MARC? It isn't a matter of can you fill it in. Of course you can fill it in. You can fill it in with, X's and zeros. So they're coming back soon, perhaps at the upcoming ALA, and they've done some mapping between MARC and RDA, but looking from the RDA point of view. And of course, there are some things that don't fit in, but of course, they're skipping some of the really deep issues, such as the fact that RDA does allow you, if you want, to replace any string with an identifier, and there's no place for that in MARC. So I see this as the beginning of that process, but I do believe, and especially because right now all of our data is in MARC, so there's going to have to be wherever we go forward, and we've got to go forward, there's going to have to be a transition. But I do assume that we will come out at the end with a very definitive standard, but it's going to look a lot more modern than the one we have now.
One of the other critiques of MARC is that only libraries use it,
Yeah.
which in turn creates the micro-universe of library vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that RDA moves a little bit to escape that, or does it perpetuate that?
I'm hoping that RDA helps us escape being in our little bibliographic silo. What is incredible when you go out and you look around, and then some of the work that I've done with folks like the Internet Archive, lots of people are interested in doing something with bibliographic data. It's not just libraries. I'm sure you've seen, a lot of this sort of, there's citation reference. I mean, look at Zotero. They're working with bibliographic data. There is a lot of use of bibliographic data, and everybody's going off in their own direction to some extent. Dublin Core has given them a little bit of a stake in the ground, but not much. I think that if we do this right, we provide something that can be used by anyone who wants to use bibliographic data, which means we do have to have it be very open, and we do have to allow for a lot of varieties of uses, but that's what application profiles are about. When I was asking how many of you have looked at ACR, one of the things that I have discovered in working with people who are discovering library data for the first time is they think it's easy. They think, library data, you've got an author, you've got a title, you got a publisher. And then when I start talking to them about, like UNESCO documents that come out that have 5 simultaneous titles in different translations, all of the different, there's no such thing as anything that can't be a repeatable field practically when you think about it. All of the complication that we go through, all of the legal documents, etc. People don't realize how complicated this world is. And I think we have something to contribute because we have all of this knowledge, we have all of this data. If we could somehow get all the library data in a semantic web compatible form and toss it out there, which I think really is what Brewster's trying to do with Open Library, I think we could really change the way people approach information seeking, and we could really bring resources like books onto the web. But our data is in this stupid MARC silo, in our databases, and other people, I have really seen other people wanting to make use of it and not being able to. So it's not like nobody else is interested. I think we have an audience for this.
looking forward to further guidance from RDA in how to translate this data. And I think I'm abstract, so to speak. Book vendors like Blackboard will still be a significant contributor to the supply chain of bibliographic data. And I think you should consult them. I think the working group consulted Blackboard's information services and gave a presentation for the conference. But I think to be realistic, a lot of the acquisitions in libraries will still go through these intermediaries. And at the data that go with it, they also have to handle it. But realistically, I think they should involve us in the discussions, because one of our complaints among the sellers is that we haven't been consulted about things, but we are very much part of the flow of the
I can't repeat all of that for the recording, but basically it was a very positive call for working with vendors, and especially with things like publishers and booksellers, because these are people who work very closely with libraries, and they have shown some initiative recently in using things like Onyx and starting to exchange data, and the Future of the Bibliographic Control report encouraged more of this exchange of data. So there is some positive. I was a little dismissive on that. That's true. There is some positive movement. So we're out of time. I thank you.